Welcome to the newest episode of All Things LOCS, a show where we discuss everything related to leadership, operations, culture, and strategies for growth. Now, if you're running an organization, you're trying to get the best out of your employees. And if you're a clinician and you're still treating patients, you're trying to get the best outcome for patients. How do you actually do this? It's not just clinical expertise. It's not your home exercise program or the surgery. What this really boils down to is a very overlooked principle: influence. How do you get people to make the right decisions, right? How many of you are out there saying, I know what's best for the patient, I just wish they would do it, right? Or I know what's best for the employee, but they don't want to follow, my guidance. And that's why today we're talking about influence, and I'm going to bring on a specialist. We're talking to Dr. Jon Robert Tartaglione, who's a psychologist and behavioral scientist. Now, his education is pretty damn extensive. He's got 2 master's degrees, one from the University of Chicago, one from the University College London, and he's got a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge. So the guy knows what he's talking about. All right, he's a world-renowned expert on influence. He's founder and CEO of Influence 51. He teaches clients across the globe about the science of persuasion. This is what we're talking about, guys: strategic communication. How can we change the way people think, behave, and choose? And he's worked with some massive clients, talking McDonald's, Visa, Boys and Girls Club, Nintendo, Texas Instruments, the list goes on. You're going to get a lot out of this. I'll see you there. All right, Jon Robert, I really appreciate you being here. Obviously, I know you're 8 hours ahead in good old England time, so appreciate you taking the time out to join us. And
My pleasure to be here, Dan. Oh, sorry, Dan.
You're good, absolutely. So I just want to kind of get right into this, man. You're really focusing on an important topic, which is influence. And I know you kind of proposed in your I found you on Podmatch, which is a platform for people who want to connect on other people's podcasts and whatnot. And you had something on there that I thought would be a good way to kind of get us started, which is that you've been driven by a singular question for the last 10 years, which is what moves people. And I'm really kind of curious to know first what took you down that pathway, because it is such a vital, important part of life, but it's also one that a lot of people tend to overlook. So I'm kind of curious to know what was so fascinating about it that you really went all in on it, and now you're bringing your expertise to other businesses and individual leaders.
Dan, honestly, it started off, I went to college and I wanted to study law, but I quickly realized that I wasn't actually interested in law. I was more interested in why do we consider these things just? And so they very quickly kind of pushed me into the philosophy department. Now, I poke fun at philosophy. I kind of make jokes about how the job market's pretty anemic for a philosophy major. And that is true. However, philosophy, for its credit, it teaches you how to think. And what I really loved about philosophy is not only teaching you the right questions to ask, but also it was this exploration of human nature, right? All these different theories about what makes people people. And so when I graduated and I was trying to kind of figure out what direction I wanted to take my life and my career in, I knew that I was interested in human nature, but I wanted a little bit more of empirical grounding. I had all these theories, and I wanted to understand, what does the data actually say? And so that's what kind of led me down the path of psychology. I didn't study psychology as an undergrad, but I just kind of became a voracious reader. The first book I ever picked up was Elliot Aronson's The Social Animal. There's another book by that name by David Brooks. I'm sure it's very good, but Elliot Aronson's is absolutely incredible. To this day, it's still my favorite book. That got me down social psychology, and then I went into moral psychology, and then into evolutionary psychology and behavioral economics, and just started this love affair with human nature and human behavior. And for me, this idea of what moves people, of what influences the way we think, make decisions, and behave, and how we can change how people do those things, is vital to pretty much any profession out there. And yet, there were all these insights that were kind of sitting unused in academia. And so I saw an opportunity to say, hey, let me take these insights to people and organizations that could actually use them. And so that's what brought me to kind of bringing insights to leaders on the one hand of organizations, and trial lawyers on the other, and financial advisors, and of course, healthcare practitioners, right? How can we improve patient experience, adherence to plans, things like that, based on psychology and behavioral science?
Yeah, see, I like that, because I'm kind of curious to know what you think about this. I do feel as if there's, for some people, a negative connotation when you say you have to influence them. It's just some people maybe take that down the wrong path where they use influence for maybe not nefarious region, but maybe some unethical things. What would you say? You just outlined some really good rationales there, but how do you really explain influence in a positive fashion in terms of being used for the right way?
Let's first start off by saying that influence and persuasion, especially, right, has developed a bad reputation for good reason. People have misused these things, right? They have had people thinking that there's not a very clear line between influence and manipulation. For my money, there's two things that push an ethical influence attempt into the domain of unethical. The first one is anything involving coercion, right? If you're feeling forced or pressured to do something that you, if left to your own volition, would not do, that's manipulation, right? That's unethical influence. The other one is deception, right? If you have to lie or falsify or provide someone with any type of misinformation or disinformation in order to make your point, that is also manipulation or unethical influence. And the tragedy really is that when you talk about influence and persuasion, it has nothing to do with these things. One of the biggest misunderstandings about persuasion, for instance, is that persuasion is this battle of arguments, that I can kind of overpower someone with logic and they're going to have to take my side. In reality, persuasion is much less about the content of your argument and much more about the approach that you use. Because you can give someone the most powerful argument in the world, but if they're not ready to hear that, if you haven't created a space between you two where they trust you, where they feel like they can open up to you, then it doesn't matter how good, how cogent your argument is. In this way, a lot of times, influence and persuasion is not so much a content problem as an access problem, right? Do I actually have access to this person's mind in a way where they're willing to reconsider their position? That's step one.
I think you made a really good point there. What do if somebody's saying, hey, how do I maybe start the process of building that trust so I can gain the influence? And I've been having conversations and I don't seem to be getting anywhere. I do feel, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do feel that we have obviously a major issue at this point, not just in healthcare or business, but in society as a whole, of actually listening and gaining another person's perspective. Where would you say, from the standpoint of gaining influence, where does listening, active listening, or empathetic listening kind of come into the play there?
It's huge. It's massive. And I think one of the biggest reorientations I help my clients understand when it comes to influence is that you are not the most persuasive person in this conversation, right? The person you're speaking to is. I mean, there's philosophical debates about whether you can ever actually really change someone's mind, or if you just provide them with enough information where maybe they can change their own mind at some point. And what we find is that throughout this process, what's far more powerful than giving people arguments is helping them, providing them with opportunities to arrive at those conclusions themselves, right? There is a concept known as self-generated persuasion, whereby individuals who come up with their own reasons for doing something, even if they're the same exact reasons that you've provided them with, tend to come to believe these things more, and these belief changes are much more durable because they have authored them themselves. They haven't been foisted upon them by anyone. It's not that anyone has kind of changed my mind. It's that I've changed my mind, right? And so when it comes to kind of the influence techniques, so to speak, I don't like to call them that because it makes it sound like you're kind of tinkering with someone. What influence ultimately is, right, is it is kind of providing someone with this space where they are comfortable interrogating their own views, thinking about their own beliefs, what we call kind of metacognition, or thinking about their own thinking. And that all starts not with giving them arguments that kind of challenge them, because that generally prompts defensiveness. It's more about asking them questions, about kind of assuming this genuine curiosity about what brought them to this point. And what we find in the literature is the more people start thinking about their thinking, the more they kind of have an opportunity to question that thinking. And that's where change really starts.
I like that. I will say, I don't know if you've ever read 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leaders, but, one of the things, the thing for me that stands out the most, and again, this is just me, and it's probably because I had the biggest issue with this back in the day when I actually struggled a lot as a leader was, seek to first understand, then be understood, right? So it's, can you understand the other person's perspective before you're trying to just ram in your own argument? And even if you're coming at it to your point, even if you're coming at it with a good heart and a good place, and maybe the tonality is actually pretty good, but you never took 1 second of time to understand the other person's side of it, you're still going to get nowhere. And I think that's the frustrating part for a lot of people when it's like, I'm trying to help them. I changed my tone. I watched Jon Robert say I got to like improve my tonality, and it's still doing nothing. And it's like, did you actually ask them any questions? No, I didn't do that. So I think it's just such an important and overlooked approach, I should say. When we're think of influence, why would you, again, we've had some negative connotation behind it, but what would you say is the main point that somebody should try to use influence for? Like if I said, why should I want to try to influence people? What would you say to me?
The first thing I would say is that our entire lives are influenced, right? I mean, every interaction you engage with someone, especially someone who either doesn't see something your way or is kind of neutral or ambivalent about something, right? We're trying to influence them, whether it be the movie we go to or the restaurant we eat at or whatever it may be. Influence is involved in it, right? And that goes from the really minute, benign things all the way up to incredibly consequential things like socio-political issues. For me, learning about influence is really important because we hold a lot of counterintuitive ideas about influence. Or I guess the better way to put it is that our intuitions often betray us when it comes to influence. So I'll give you a really quick example, right? Most people, when they think about the brain, they assume that the human brain is kind of like a computer. It works like a computer does, meaning that it tries to optimize for accuracy and for truth. In reality, when we look at the human brain and humans in general, humans are less kind of perfectly rational decision makers, and we're more aptly described as rationalizing creatures. And there's a really important distinction there, right? If we were perfectly rational beings, our brains would work kind of like scientists do, where they would take every piece of information, they would evaluate them objectively and impartially, and try to render the most accurate possible decision. In reality, our brains work a lot more like trial lawyers do. They have these things that they're trying to defend, these opinions that we hold, these beliefs we hold, these worldviews that we hold. They're trying to defend them, and so they're going about preferentially seeking out information that enables them to build the best case to defend their client, so to speak, right? And this is such an interesting and counterintuitive thing for people, and it's frustrating. A lot of the frustration that people get when they try to influence someone comes from misunderstandings like this, because they say, I gave them all the information, I gave them the best argument, and they didn't move. It was like it bounced right off of them. And that's because they had this kind of fundamental misunderstanding of what actually moves people. It's not just the data and the evidence and the argument, it's how you present it, where you present it, in the company of whom you present it, and also understanding that your data, even if it's statistically identical, can be received very differently depending on how you frame it. Whether you talk about a 90% chance of survival or a 10% chance of mortality, even though they're statistically identical, it makes an impact on how people receive it because we're not perfectly logical decision makers.
I feel like you read my mind there because that's actually the perfect segue for what I want to ask you, because you're talking about intelligent people and how there's a the mentality of a trial lawyer versus maybe a scientist, where things are very step by step, very data driven, and then in healthcare, same aspect. It's a lot of very analytical mentality for a lot of people, a lot of intelligence, but then there's a lot of resistance to new workflows, technology, accountability, even some things where there's a rejection of empirical evidence, where everything is, for the most part, very evidence-based. Why do what would you say is the main reason that people resist change, even if they know it's the right decision? And ultimately, what can leaders do differently to help overcome that?
Tend to resist change because we build these identities, right? Our data is not just built to kind of keep an accurate view of the world. It's built and retained in such a way as to retain positive identities for who we are, for who our group is, and for kind of what our worldviews are. And so when you're trying to change someone, what you're up against is you're up against their perceptions of themselves, their perceptions of the world. And these things provide them with a certain level of safety, comfort, and stability. And so again, part of when it comes to change is that if you want someone to change something and you are trying to force that change upon them, it feels like a threat. It feels like this individual is threatening beliefs that define who I am, or beliefs that define the worldview I hold. And so ultimately, that threat is going to be treated like any other threat, right? You're going to put up your defenses and you're going to put up your guard and you're going to counter argue with them. And this is why when it comes to kind of creating durable change, we have to give individuals the opportunity to kind of author these things themselves, to come to these conclusions on their own. And we've talked about this idea of things like questions, but it's not necessarily questions. Sometimes it's about getting individuals to see where there may be inconsistencies between kind of what they believe and what they do. So I'll give you a really fascinating example, okay? Back maybe about a little more than a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, the Thai Health Foundation did this incredible campaign where they sent out representatives to go up to smokers who were on their smoke break, sitting outside buildings in Thailand, and ask them if they could have a light, right? This is a super, super common thing in the smoking community. It's very normal for someone to come up and say, hey, can I get a light? And you kind of give it to them. These smokers, when they were approached like this, right, got really taken aback. And they were like, what are you talking about? Of course not. I'm not going to give you a light. And it sounds peculiar why they would react like that, but it's because the Thai Health Foundation had sent out these kids who were like 7 and 8 years old to ask these smokers for a light, right? And so, they immediately fire back at them. Are you kidding me? These things will kill you. What are you doing even thinking about smoking? It's awful. It's horrible for your health. It's horrible for your teeth, the aesthetics, like all these kind of arguments for them. And they instructed these kids, after they get kind of lambasted for asking them, just to smile and hand them a note. So they smile, they hand them a note, and they walk away. And they unravel this note, and it says, you care about me and you know the right thing to do. Why don't you care as much about yourself? Okay? Now, what this campaign did that was really brilliant is it didn't say, right? It didn't send people up and saying, let me tell you exactly what you already know about how these things are bad for them, because they do already have that data, right? But they're defending against that data. They're building stories about why that data doesn't matter to them, it doesn't apply to them. But what they did here is they utilized a technique that we call cognitive dissonance. It's more of a phenomenon than a technique. But cognitive dissonance is this really interesting phenomenon whereby when we hold either two conflicting beliefs or a belief and a behavior that conflict with one another, we feel compelled to kind of resolve those. And what that means is we often have to either change our belief or change our behavior. What they did really beautifully is they showed these smokers that you have this dissonance between what you believe and what you're doing, right? You clearly believe that smoking is bad and yet you're still doing it. But they didn't force that upon them. They allowed them to come to that conclusion themselves. And what they found is within a week, calls to the hotline had jumped by like 70%. Right? Because they were allowing these individuals to be the author of their own change, to come to the conclusions on their own rather than them being lectured about it. And that plays a huge, huge role.
I like that a lot. I mean, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And, I know that's a big challenge in the healthcare space where we're so good at telling people what they should be doing because we all, we just know so much better than them. And we, like you said, we learned all the data. But I do remember, it's funny as you're talking about that, kind of makes me think of when I would, work with smokers. I was in when I was treating patients, and same, kind of same approach I would take is you're not here to hear from the 10th person to tell you that smoking is terrible for you. You know this. We have enough data. You see the commercials. I was like, but let me just help you understand what smoking is maybe doing to your healing process and how you can make some small adjustments to the way you actually do smoke to actually maybe maximize what you're getting by coming to see me. So do think that's really an important principle when you're looking at the aspect nowadays, especially where you're presenting facts and people know they're right, but they still want to resist it. Would you still attribute that to, hey, maybe you didn't take enough time to listen to them and get their perspective, or maybe the way you approached giving them the information is what kind of hurt you?
So let me start off with another quick example that I think a lot of people resonate with, right? When I'm teaching about strategic communication, and we get to this idea about kind of persuasion and change. The first thing I'll always say is like, imagine that you and I, we go to a museum. Okay, we're going in an art museum. It's only you and I are there. Let's just say it's only you there, Dan, right? And you're going around, you're admiring all the beautiful paintings, and you go to a room completely empty except a statue sitting in the middle of it. So you go up to the statue, and it's incredible. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of art you've ever seen. But you notice something to the left of the statue. Okay, it's a sign that says, "Do not touch the art." What's the first thing you suddenly want to do?
People are going to want to touch that art.
Weirdest phenomenon, right? But it's actually a phenomenon that's been studied by psychologists. It's called psychological reactance. Basically, when human beings feel that their autonomy is being constrained, that their freedom to do or choose as they wish is being compromised, we instinctively push back, right? It's kind of this like built-in anti-coercion software that we have. And it's such a strong impulse that we push back even against things that we want, right? Like, I love ice cream, but if you were to come up to me as I'm eating an ice cream cone and say, "Yeah, eat that ice cream cone," suddenly I'm not going to want to do it, right? I want to spite you for making me feel like you can force me into doing something. And so psychological reactance is perhaps the most important phenomenon to understand when it comes to kind of understanding persuasion better, because it goes to show that it's not just about kind of what you're saying, but also how you're saying it, right? If you are doing it in a way that seems like it's constraining people's choice, it doesn't matter how good the advice is. People will resist. And so one of the first things you have to do is you have to figure out, how do I present this information in a way that doesn't feel like I'm challenging them? It doesn't feel like I'm pushing back against their freedom. It's not a threat to their ego or their identity, right? These are all kind of considerations that we have to factor in. And a lot of times what that means is it means kind of taking a step back, and rather than giving an expert approach, right, where I'm the expert and you need to listen to me, it needs to be a little bit more collaborative. It needs to be kind of, help me understand how we can take what I know and take what you're willing and comfortable to do and find the right balance there. And what I'll say when it comes to kind of this type of interaction is there was a study that was done back in, I want to say it was 2007. Researchers were having people build pieces of IKEA furniture. Have you ever built IKEA furniture?
I have not had the pleasure, no.
You use the operative word there, which is the pleasure, okay? And obviously, sarcastically, because IKEA furniture, you emerge a very different person than you went in there building. But they had people build IKEA furniture, which is as frustrating of a process as you would imagine. And the furniture, sometimes doesn't come out looking quite as good as it does on the packaging, right? It comes out, it's a little bit misshapen and kind of oddly proportioned. But what they found really interesting, these researchers kind of stumbled upon this finding where people were willing to pay more for the furniture that they had assembled, even if it was imperfect, than a perfectly assembled piece of furniture that was made by an expert, okay? And they came to call this the IKEA effect, where people value things that they have built more than things that have been built better by someone else, okay? And this IKEA effect we've now found extends to things like ideas and plans. And so when healthcare practitioners are working with someone, yes, you have the best data, you have the best evidence, but people aren't going to value it as much. They're not going to try to adhere to it as much if they feel like it was just this perfect piece of furniture given to them, or worse yet, forced upon them by an expert. Instead, we have to engage with these individuals in a way where they feel like they are contributing to building this health plan or this behavior change plan. And sometimes that can be as simple as, hey, we know that the data says the best time to take this medicine is in the morning. What do you think would work best for your schedule between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m.? Can you let me know what you think would work best? And give them an opportunity to say, you know what, I get up at 7 and by 9 I'm already in work, so I'm thinking somewhere between 8 and 9 would probably work best. Perfect. 8 and 9 is a great thing. Let's write that down, right? But giving them an opportunity to build this with you, because even if it's not going to be as perfect as the one you would have built for them, the fact that they contributed makes them value it more.
Man, that's powerful, because I'm also thinking then, as you're laying out the IKEA principle, it's not even and I just want to make sure I'm getting this right too. It sounds like you're saying how you're relating and conversing to employees, but then I'm also thinking about this from the perspective of maybe the owner, executive who has the same mentality, right? It's like, I know better, or this is what we need. You guys are, not privy to the information that I have. I'm giving you the information and you're still resistant, and I find that's very challenging for a lot of really good leaders too. It's not even just, I know we think of bad leadership, but you have those really great leaders who just have a hard time articulating. And then they might come to you and say, I don't know what it is. We have a great rapport with the team, but then the adoption rate, the ability, right, for the organization to start adopting to new things that we're trying to incorporate is terrible. And they're just really confused as to what they can do.
Part of it, right, especially when it comes to adoption, change. Humans have this thing called status quo bias, right, where we tend to prefer things as they were, and anything that deviates from the status quo feels like a loss, right? And so people will stick with these bad things that they know rather than move to kind of potentially better things that they don't. When it comes to kind of facilitating change, a lot of what you need to do is you need to flip the framing, okay? And so before I talk about that, let me take a quick step back, because I don't want to patronize. I'm sure we have a lot of smart people listening in on this, but just so everyone's on the same page. Imagine, Dan, you're sitting on a park bench, right? I approach you with an opportunity for a gamble. I say, in my pocket, I have a coin. It's a fair coin, but if you don't trust me, we can use a coin in your pocket. In a moment, I'm going to flip that coin. If it comes up heads, I'm going to hand you $10,000 in cash. But if it comes up tails, you have to hand me $10,000 in cash. Do you accept the gamble? Now, what's really interesting about this question is that 80 to 90% of people will say, no, thank you. Okay, not for me. Now, I don't know if you felt like that, but the vast majority of people do. And that should strike you as peculiar, because if humans, again, were perfectly logical decision makers, half of us should say yes, and half should say no. It's a 50-50 chance. But we don't. And we don't because of this cognitive bias we have called loss aversion. Okay? Loss aversion is essentially this phenomenon whereby losses loom larger than gains. Although the idea of winning $10,000 feels good, it doesn't feel as good as the idea of losing $10,000 feels bad. In this way, losses are more psychologically evocative in a way, is a nice way to think about it. Now, this has a huge implications when it comes to things like communication, because a lot of leaders that operate under this idea that humans are logical decision makers also assume that it doesn't matter how I present the data or the new plan, because the data is the data is the data. But what we find, right, is that it does matter. And I'll give you a really quick example before I go back into the organizational context. Back in the early 1980s, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Nobel Prize winners, were some of the first people to investigate this, okay? They ran this study where they gave working physicians a vignette about lung cancer. And they said, in cases of lung cancer, surgery is the best option, but it's not without its risks. 10% of people who undergo lung cancer surgery don't make it past the first month. Now, unbeknownst to these physicians, that number was either framed as the 90% survival rate in the first month, or there's a 10% mortality rate in the first month. Now, these are the same exact thing. They're statistically identical. But they found that the physicians that read the survival rate frame recommended surgery 84% of the time. The ones that read the mortality rate frame recommended surgery 50% of the time. These are working physicians reading the same exact data and coming to a 34 percentage point difference in their recommendations. And this is all based on how we differentially experience loss versus gain. So when we go back to the leadership context, right, we have to think about how do we make sure that we are optimizing our communication strategy when it comes to something like change. Because most people see change as a loss, right? It feels more psychologically potent than any potential gains you might be able to show if we did change, okay? And so what you need to do, what I advise my clients to do often, is that you need to kind of flip the framing. You need to, instead of saying all the things we can gain from doing this new thing, you need to ask them, what are all the things we're losing by not doing this new thing, right? Use loss to your advantage in this way by surfacing the cost, often the invisible costs, of staying the same, of adhering to the status quo.
Yeah, I really like that, and it's definitely something that I've had, to utilize myself. But I do find it's a very interesting point where people will always focus on. It really just comes off like a more of a negative mentality. Doesn't mean they're a negative individual, but there's definitely more people saying, "What if?" Right? What if this goes wrong? Or if I have the conversation and they get angry, or I make the decision and I end up failing, and then in this instance, we're not even talking about what part of the journey we're at. Some people never even get started with a journey because all those thoughts pop into their head versus, all right, just what if it goes right? Or what if this ends up being the best thing I ever did? And the same approach for whether it's an employer or a patient. I'm kind of, I think I'm almost about the scenario I had a long time ago where a clinician, talking about how to get adoption rate up and framing the positive versus negatives, and we're moving over to a new electronic health record system, which is a massive pain in the butt. But to your example, it was a necessary thing. You're a growing organization. We aged out of the previous technology, the software we needed to upgrade. And I remember telling somebody who's a little bit older, and she immediately jumped out of my throat. She's like, "Oh, come on, we're changing." And like, all right, let's understand. To your point, is like, let's understand what we're actually losing by keeping the same system that maybe you're not seeing behind the scenes, and how do we maybe just, why don't we give this a shot? Explain to me, what your thoughts are, but why don't we just give this a shot, and we'll revisit it, and you let me know if it's terrible. And she was fine. Like she said after a while, she's like, I just, but to your point though, we make very emotional decisions, and then we try to, we make emotional decisions and then try to rationalize it with the proper, practical way of thinking. But then we just get so confused when they don't make the right decisions, right? So it's very important understanding there. And, we're talking a lot about how to communicate to employees, but then also you made a good point too, is what can clinicians do? Because, for some people listening saying, well, I'm great at this, but I have certain clinicians, doctors, therapists, whatever it may be, who are not so good at this with patients. What could they do? They're face to face, like maybe I'm talking to you and I'm the patient, or I'm the doctor and you're the patient. And I'm going to say, hey, look, I have 5 minutes to get through this visit. How the hell am I supposed to influence this patient positively? I just got to tell them the facts and tell them what we're going to do, and that's it. How do you help that person?
Two quick examples that I think would be when I do work with kind of healthcare practitioners. These are some of the things that we talk about. The first one is let's stick with framing really quick, because I think one of the most important skills you can develop if you're trying to improve your strategic communication is coming to this realization that there are many different ways you can present the same exact information. Now, I just said loss versus gain. That's kind of the most popular, the most widely known outside of psychology. There's plenty of other examples. I'll give two really quick ones. When you talk about things like numbers, right? There's something that we differentiate between frequencies versus probabilities, okay? There was a famous study that was done where they kind of told people to assume the role of like a parole board. And they gave half the people information that said 10% of patients like Mr. Jones, if released, will go commit a violent crime. The other half, they said 10 out of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, if released, will commit a violent crime. What they found was in the former, the kind of probability framing, only 21% of people denied discharge. But in the latter, frequency framing, 41% of people denied discharge. Now, once again, 10% and 10 out of 100 are exactly the same, but they have very, very different impacts on people. And what makes frequencies really, really powerful is that frequencies are much easier to visualize. You just talked about how we're emotional creatures, and it's much easier to visualize what 10 out of every 100 people that I would be responsible for releasing, terrorizing a neighborhood might look like versus a more abstract 10% of people, right? And so things like understanding how frequencies and probabilities might differentially impact someone is another way we can think of like, how do we frame this message? I'll talk maybe later about metaphor if you want to get into metaphor, but that would take maybe another more time than I want to spend on this response. The other big thing I want to say with this response about like, how do we have 5 minutes, how do we make an impact? Stories. Stories are so incredibly powerful, okay? Human beings have evolved to be influenced through stories. Stories have these incredible ability, right, to bypass our natural reactance, our natural tendency to push back, right? When you give someone facts and figures and data, a natural inclination for someone, especially if they're feeling defensive, is to kind of push back, to give you counter arguments and counter facts. What we find is that stories do something which psychologists refer to as narrative transportation, meaning that stories, rather than encouraging kind of pushback, they encourage people to simulate and empathize. Okay, so rather than coming up with counter arguments, when you tell someone a story, their natural reaction is to kind of simulate what that person was going through and feel the way they felt. That's the first power of stories, right? If you want to kind of make a connection with someone, rather than starting to hit them with all the data, stories are kind of the vehicle through which that data will actually get through someone's kind of, intuitive resistance. But the other really powerful thing about stories is human beings tend to suffer from something which we call the identifiable victim effect. This is another kind of cognitive quirk we have where humans are much more responsive. We become much more motivated to help by learning of the story of one single person in need than the story of thousands of nameless, faceless people in need, right? And again, this is kind of this misapprehension that people who think we're logical creatures think, well, if it's 1,000 people, it should be 1,000 times more powerful. But in reality, we find that human beings are much better at extrapolating from the singular, from taking a lesson from a single individual and applying it broadly than they are of taking these kind of broad lessons and deducing down to themselves. So this is the other benefit of stories, is that not only do stories kind of bypass this reactance, but stories tend to motivate us more because we're able to look at individuals and say, okay, I know a person like that, or that person reminds me of this individual. I can see myself in that person. And so if you're trying to deter someone from something like binge drinking, right? Yeah, you can tell them all the different facts about how binge drinking impacts someone. Or you can tell the story. You can sit them down and tell a story about how someone you knew, you cared about, who reminds you of them, binge drinking in a way that kind of changed their life, right? And a lot of times, this is what gets through to someone. And even if it doesn't get through the first time, the thing that stories do that are also really important is they engage the emotional side of the individual first. So even if you don't convince them right off the bat, if you can get them being more receptive emotionally, right? All of a sudden, those statistics that would have been blocked if you had just led with them, they become more receptive to those statistics and data as well.
Do you believe that to be more of that storyteller, which, yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I've seen that within my own, career, the difference you can make from going to from a very statistic-oriented kind of messaging to more of a storytelling. Would you say that developing more of that empathy is a requirement to be a better storyteller, or would you say it's not relevant? And I'm really asking that just because I know in medicine, particularly, at least in the United States, it's a very difficult skill set for a lot of clinicians, especially doctors. But it's also, I know, the one attribute that patients are looking for the most that they get the least.
I think that, so here's what I'll say. If you want to be an excellent storyteller, right, that's something that does tend to come from having that spot in your heart where you can really empathize and really kind of, dig deep and tell a story, because people can, people are hypersensitive to people faking it, right? Like, they can tell when someone is doing this because they're trying to manipulate me or they're trying to change me. And so there is, it's part of the reason why, I see all this BS about like influence tactics and persuasion secrets that'll, make everyone say yes. Anyone who's selling you that doesn't understand human nature well enough, okay? It's BS. They think you're naive enough to believe that, and a lot of people are. If you really want to change someone, okay, then you need to approach them in a way that kind of honors the fact that they're not an idiot, they're not foolish. And so, rehearsing stories in a way that you're like, I don't care, I just want to get this out so they hear it, they can probably, sense that type of transparency. However, what I will say is that there's kind of a middle ground there between like, I want storytelling to be my craft and I'm going to build that empathic muscle, and like, I'm just going to recite the absolute bare minimum. Because there are elements of stories that make them more or less compelling. For instance, one of the most powerful elements of a story is what's called the inciting incident. Okay, a lot of leaders, I'll give you a quick example. When leaders are trying to inspire a team, right? When I'm working with leaders and I say, give me something that will inspire your team, a story you would tell. They turn to a story of success, right? The time that they kind of, closed the big deal or won the big case, whatever it may be. But they leave out something really critical. They leave out the failure before the success. And the way I try to explain to them why that's relatively ineffective, and I say, take a movie that you find really inspirational or really motivating, okay? For my father, it's the Rocky series. My father, when he puts on Rocky, he thinks he is Rocky, right? He's sitting in his chair, he's pumping his fists, he's super amped. But I said, imagine if I sat you down to watch Rocky 2, let's say, or Rocky 3. But instead of watching the whole movie, we fast forward to the last 20 minutes. You see Rocky win, he kind of hoists the belt, and the credits roll. Is that going to inspire you in the same way that watching the whole movie is? And of course the answer is no, because what makes movies like Rocky inspiring to people like my father is not that he won. It's that here's a guy who was knocked down, beat up, counted out, and refused to lose. In the same way, leadership stories, the ones that are powerful, are not the ones where the leader won something or did something great. It's the ones where they constantly failed, right? Sometimes in ways that they didn't think they were going to get back up from, and yet they did, right? We are inspired not by infallible leaders, but by leaders who are fallible like us. That's what makes them relatable. And so I say this as a roundabout way of getting back to this idea that there are certain elements of stories like that inciting incident where this kind of picture-perfect thing is thrown into disarray that make them more engaging, that make people kind of perk up and listen. And so there are certain elements of stories that even if you kind of don't want to dedicate your life to learning the craft of storytelling, if you understand that I need to have these elements, you stand a better chance of kind of making a story or telling a story that's going to move someone.
It's and I love they brought that up. Those are all amazing points, and it is quite interesting how we do tend to focus on just here's all the good stuff, even though people learn best from the failures, or you look at some of the best people in history, the Thomas Edisons of the world. So it's people like, oh, he failed 10,000 times. Like, all right, but then we're always looking for how'd you become successful versus kind of gleaning those lessons. I'm also just kind of curious, for you on a personal and business perspective. You obviously have grown your own career. You mentioned something in prior when we were talking, just like the aspect of people focusing on, you're doing well now, so you must have had it pretty easy throughout your whole journey. But you wrote something in the pre-show discovery form that I really thought was quite interesting. So I'd be curious to know if you could expand on that. Like, what's something that people assume about your success that actually isn't true? Kind of picking right off the point you just made.
So my mom still tells this story, right? I decided what I wanted. I wanted to do this, right? I just finished a master's program in London. This was back in 2016, end of 2016. I realized there was an opportunity to teach people about psychology, right? To bring psychology and psychological insights to domains where they weren't using them, but they could really benefit them. Went back home, had this great idea. I would sit down at my kitchen table. I went to live with my parents for the first 3 months I was back home. Every day I would sit down at my kitchen table. I would manually write 500 emails a day, okay, to 500 different people. If I was lucky, I would receive maybe 4 responses back, 3 of which would tell me to go screw myself, never contact them again, right? And one would be okay, tell me what you're doing, tell me what you're trying to do, right? But point is, for the first year I formally started this business, I had 1 client. He paid for a $300 workshop. That was it for the entire first year. Part of the challenge I had was A, what I'm doing is a little bit niche, but B, and perhaps more confusing to people, right, is I'm not working with just one industry, I'm taking something like strategic communication. It's the same concepts, it's the same research often that I'm teaching people about, but I'm applying it to very different contexts. I'm teaching organizational leaders about this, and then I'm teaching trial lawyers about this, and then I'm teaching medical professionals about this, and then I'm teaching nonprofit executives about this. And so there was this concern, this kind of underlying concern of is this person a jack of all trades and a master of none, right? Like, will they be able to provide value for me? So long story short, right? Like, I was not like an overnight success. And I just talked to someone actually who's like starting a business, and they called me and asked me for help. And I was like, don't get caught up in people saying they just started their business and they already have 4 contracts, right? Like, I had one $300 contract in my whole first year. Now, I was maybe very slow, okay? I have trouble like reaching out to people and asking for help, so I was doing it all myself. But the point is like, it took me a very long time. And what I came to realize is that what I do is best experienced, right? Part of the reason that I do podcasts now is because I send people an email about like, hey, here's what I do, and they're kind of like, I still don't get it. I still don't understand, right? But when I do a workshop, when I do a keynote, when I show them how these things work, when I give them an opportunity to experience something like loss aversion and then show them how they can use that to improve their communication, right? They get it. And so all of my clients now, virtually all of my clients have come from like seeing me deliver the work. And that like was a very much a learning process for me. I am someone who failed a lot. I learned a lot of very hard lessons. I was not successful by any means for the first several years of kind of doing this business. And in a lot of ways, I got lucky that a very large client saw something I had posted somewhere, brought me in for like a tryout, and hired me on the spot, right? They saw the content, they saw the value in it, they hired me on the spot. And from there, it becomes a snowball, right? Oh, you work with McDonald's and Visa, come work with us. Oh, you work with EY and Texas Instruments, come work. So I got lucky in that regard, but it took a very, very long time. And there were times where someone like me who's sensitive to rejection, having to hear, send out 500 emails and get 498 back that said absolutely not, if they responded at all, it was hard. I almost quit a lot of times. I'm glad I didn't, but I understand the urge to do so.
I will have to admit, you're being a little humble. Definitely did the work, right? And you said you put years in. I mean, I totally get it. I'm the same way. It's like, I definitely got lucky at one person, but, you posted the content, you did the talk or whatever that content was, like you put it out there, you overcame any insecurities you might have probably still had at that point anyway. And I do find that's what a lot of people tend to miss about even the people that are really doing well, is that I do believe that we automatically assume that once you maybe hit a certain level of success, you're like, okay, like I'm good, versus they still have the doubts, right? Like those doubts don't necessarily go away. It's just you learn to chase something bigger than yourself. So I'm kind of curious to know, what was it when you were going through those lean years where you're like, all right, I only got $300 coming in this year, the next year wasn't so great. What was it that really kept you going down this lane?
Let me answer that, and then I'll give a similar answer to something that's also maybe people struggle with, and maybe it will help them, right? The answer to the first question is that I knew this content was valuable. Even though people couldn't see it, I knew that once they gave it a chance, they would understand. And that ultimately is what happened, right? Is that people who didn't understand the value of this content in this kind of more, abstract domain of like a cold email, right? When they sat in a workshop and they watched me talk about things like loss aversion or things like self-generated persuasion or things like message framing, right? They got it. All of a sudden, the wheels start turning, and they're like, oh, I can use this here, and we can use this here. And similar to things you were doing, right? Talking about how leaders can use this, but practitioners can use this, right? We start getting those wheels turning. And so for me, it really was just a very strong conviction that, like, I need that one person to give me a shot. And listen, like, I very well could have been delusional. Maybe, that one person gave me a shot and they were like, this is ridiculous, this will never work. Maybe I would have broken that delusion. But fortunately for me, it doesn't seem like I was delusional, right? That person gave me a shot and they hired me on the spot type thing. And so what really kept me going beyond, the things that everyone wants, like a supportive network, I did have my parents, and my fiance, at the time, and girlfriend at the time, and now wife, who saw what I was developing and understood the value and kind of pushed me and encouraged me, especially on the days I was down about myself. And so that's what kept me going. But, I also got to say, I'm a one-person operation. I'm a one-person operation by design because I like the flexibility of being able to do everything. I like working with clients. I don't want to send other people out to work with clients. I want to be the one that sits in front of you and comes up with the ways to kind of, improve your communications or your persuasion or your influence strategy. The challenge is I don't like self-promotion. Okay, I find self-promotion really icky, right? Like I hate LinkedIn. I absolutely hate LinkedIn because I am not the type of person who can go on there and brag about myself and not go to bed feeling like slimy and sticky. Like it just doesn't work with me, right? This was a huge kind of detractor from my growth because I was not someone going out and singing my own praises, right? I was not going and telling people how amazing I was, even though, privately, might I believe that? Yeah, I do. Like, I think, if I'm being honest now, if I'm kind of throwing humility to the wind, I think I'm the best of the planet at what I do. I think I'm excellent. I think you need to have that type of confidence, right? But I don't like telling people that. I don't like saying it. It feels weird to me. And so I was fortunate enough to have an individual who was, by the way, the first individual who actually said to me, I think you're the best on the planet at this, okay? He was someone that had worked at McDonald's. He had worked at Boys and Girls Clubs of America. He came up to me and he said, Tat, listen, everyone calls me Tat, by the way. This is a weird time to kind of announce that. But he said, Tat, listen. He says, first of all, if you don't get out there and tell people how great you are, someone else who's not as good is going to tell them, right? He's like, that's the first thing. He said, and that leads into the second point, which is I don't want you to look at self-promotion as you trying to enhance your own wealth or well-being or whatever it may be. I want you to look at it as if you don't do this, there are organizations out there who could benefit from you who are going to lose out, right? And so don't look at this as a selfish thing. Look at this as a selfless thing, like an uncomfortable, selfless thing you're doing. And, I think why that really resonated with me, right, is he was basically teaching me framing, right, which is something I go and teach clients all the time. He was saying, instead of looking at it like this, look at that same exact behavior like this. And that kind of fundamentally reoriented how I think about myself. I still don't feel great going, and I have to post on LinkedIn sometimes. I still don't feel great going out and I'm not the type of person who's going to, position themselves as like a guru who can solve everything. But I will go and say, hey, if you want better behavior change, if you want change that's grounded in psychology that can actually help you and your people, I'm the person for the job. And it was because this individual changed the way I look at that practice.
That really is quite relevant. I mean, I had the same conversation with my wife, and to a point, shout out to families and our spouses or that support, right? That circle of people that are really close to us that give us that lift up when we're really struggling, at believe in us when we want to maybe give up. So shout out to those individuals for sure. But yeah, to your point, that this is an aspect of things that maybe you don't want to do, but it's all right. What am I actually denying somebody else? I think I had somebody else tell me that similar. All right, you're almost being selfish by not putting yourself out there, not getting on social media maybe, and because you're not helping somebody. I was like, ooh, all right. And that's a message I still have to recall sometimes, especially when it comes to social media. I do go on LinkedIn, but even other platforms, some days I'm like, I don't want to do this, but then it's like, what am I actually doing this for? I'm not doing it to promote myself. It's to help somebody else. So love that, because a lot of people in healthcare also who I don't want to go on LinkedIn or do anything on social media. Then they want to complain about all the influencers who are, trashing medicine or giving crappy advice. I'm like, you got to go out there and promote it. You're not helping somebody by just complaining about it to your colleagues. As we're kind of coming towards the tail end a bit, I want to know what is I like to go over your 5 principles of influence, something that's actionable that we can leave the audience with, that's going to be highly important and really help them start gaining some traction.
So I'll run through the 5 principles really quick, and I'll talk about one that we didn't really get to talk about that I think is useful. Basically, the 5 principles were when I'm teaching people about influence is this kind of complex, multifaceted concept. I couldn't teach you all the things about influence if we sat down for a month, And so I had to figure out how do I teach non-academics, non-psychologists influence in the most palatable, digestible way. So I came up with the 5 principles, which I think are the 5 most important things to understand about how people think, make decisions, behave, that I could possibly think of. 5 principles are, most of these we touched upon already. The human brain is not a computer, right? This idea that we're not perfectly logical decision makers. And a lot of these are downstream from that. Principle two, which I'll go back to in a moment, is that our social nature matters. We are not just individuals, we are socially embedded decision makers, right? Principle three actually looks at differences in worldviews. And it gets into more kind of the political side, and people think like, does politics really factor into things that are non-political? And the answer is yes. We have a lot of information to show that liberals and conservatives see the world differently, process information differently, respond to arguments differently. And so your approach, your communication style needs to be different with them as well. Principle four is this idea that approach matters. And I like to say that minds open from the inside, right? You can't force your way in. You kind of think of it as like private property, right? You have to get an invite into someone's private property before they'll kind of consider your arguments, before they're willing to entertain an alternative point of view and not just defend against it. And principle five is all about framing and structure and presentation, right? That you can take the same information, tweak it very slightly, seemingly insignificantly, and yet get very different responses from individuals, right? Based on loss versus gain, frequency versus probability, the metaphors we use, the analogies we choose, et cetera, et cetera. The one I'll kind of leave people with is the one we didn't really talk about. This is things like us being social creatures and how that impacts how and why we change, right? One of the most powerful areas of study within this umbrella is social norm adherence, right? We tend to do what other people seem to be doing. And this is a really, really powerful thing that we can leverage as well. One of the challenges with social norms is that social norms can be misperceived, right? I can look out and let's use the example of a college campus, right? If I'm on a college campus and someone asks me, what percentage of your peers are binge drinking? I might give something like, 50, 60%, right? Because I look out and the people that are being most vocal are often the binge drinkers, talking about how they got wasted on Saturday, right? And so, you get this skewed view of what most people are doing, what the norm actually is. These we can call misperceived norms. The interesting thing about misperceived norms is that we have researchers show that in order to change behavior in a really significant way, all you have to do is correct these misperceptions. Simply by going up to individuals and saying, hey, you thought 50 or 60% of your peers were binge drinking. In reality, the number is like 7, 8% of people that are binge drinking, maybe less. All you have to do is correct that misperception, and you get this corresponding shift in someone's behavior, right? Where all of a sudden, binge drinking on college campuses goes down. It's the same exact principle, whether you're talking about changing behavior in an organization or changing behavior with a patient. Like, yes, it's important to give them data and statistics, but sometimes it's also important to understand that if you're talking with someone who is surrounded by smokers or drinkers or pill abusers, right? They have this idea that this is what people just do. This is kind of how people are. And if you can help them understand that actually, you might be misperceiving that. Actually, most of your people, right, are trying to live healthy lifestyles. They're making efforts. They're making strides. They're probably exercising more than you realize or eating healthy more than you realize, right? Planting this seed that the people that I'm modeling my behavior off of, I might have a misreading on how they're actually behaving, on what they're actually doing, is one of the more powerful catalysts of change. And so understanding that we're not just making decisions as individuals, we are kind of socially embedded decision makers that are looking to see what others are doing, because these are not only sources of information, but sources of safety, right? If everyone's doing it, I should do it too.
It's the old, if Jimmy jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? It's like, yeah, well, in this case, like, yeah, most people.
Yeah, everyone's doing it.
You mentioned it, and I'm glad you actually brought it up, was the liberal versus the conservative, which, in the past, that really wouldn't be much to talk about. The mentality is always there, but you do see that that's actually becoming more prevalent nowadays in just society as a whole, where there's this massive labeling of you're one of the two. You're either left and you're far left, or you're conservative and you're extremely conservative. But we don't talk about how do you communicate to those people. And that, obviously, if we knew how to do that, we'd be in a better position. But for your instance, where, all right, if we take the time to listen, that to me is important, not just from the standpoint of connecting some massive differences of opinions, but I look at this almost, and you correct me if I'm wrong if I'm just way off base here, I look at this even from an organizational standpoint. Maybe it's not conservative versus liberal, but different people have different cultures, different backgrounds. It's almost like, how do you? So we'll stay on the liberal versus conservative first, because that is like definitely very prevalent in the U.S. I don't want to assume, but I see a lot of it in the UK as well. But talk to me through that. Like, you have those two camps. Like, all right, guys, here's how we're kind of talking to those two, and knowing that we have those two people in our organization, and we want to get the best out of them.
So let me first give a little note of hope here, right? Because I talk about this, and so I in my PhD research, I was actually at Cambridge. I was in the political psychology lab, so that was what we were looking at. We were looking at like how liberals and conservatives respond to different information, different appeals, different messaging strategies, et cetera, et cetera. Political psychology is both endlessly fascinating and incredibly frustrating. Okay, because you start to realize, like, on the one hand, there are some promising things. On the other hand, there are certain people that, like, you can tell them that their candidate just went and punched a puppy and they're going to find a way to justify it, right? There are certain people that are unreachable. The challenge, right, is that these extreme individuals, we go back to misperceived norms. People think that the majority of the other side, quote unquote, is like them. But there is a phenomenon that's been documented for 50 years now, going on 60, called false polarization, whereby although polarization is real, although we don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, the degree to which we disagree is habitually overestimated, okay? Sometimes by a factor of 1.5 or 2, okay? And so what this means is that there are a lot of individuals on either side of the aisle who can find ways to agree with each other, even on super, super polarizing issues, okay? You have a lot of moderates that often are kind of, compressed into this dichotomy of, right, are you liberal or conservative? And more than that, this kind of extreme skewing of the dichotomy that, like, conservatives are these kind of, crazy people yelling at me on this side, and liberals are these crazy people yelling at me on this side. The nice thing is that false polarization exists. It's something that's existed for a very long time. And so you probably see the other side as more different from you than they actually are, right? When it comes to extremity. That's nice to hear. But there are real differences. Now, when people talk about differences between liberals and conservatives, a lot of people like to talk about things like neurological and genetic differences. Now, these do exist. We have research to show that, for instance, one of the kind of gold standard of nature versus nurture claims, the way of teasing them apart is using twins, because you have monozygotic twins who share 100% of their DNA and dizygotic who share 50%. What we find is that not only do monozygotic twins tend to have political orientations that correlate more strongly than dizygotic twins, but even when monozygotic twins are raised apart in different environments, their political orientations continue to correlate, whereas dizygotic do not, right? So there are real kind of genetic predispositions towards kind of seeing one side of the political spectrum as being more legible or feeling more right, okay? But for my money, this isn't kind of the heart of where disagreements actually lie. For me, the majority of disagreements can be traced back to disagreements about premises that we can't agree on, okay? And those three premises for me are, what is human nature? What is the world like? And what is justice? What is right and wrong? And so I'll give you just a really quick example, right? When you talk about human nature, you ask people kind of what is human nature? Some people tend to see human nature as constrained, that humans are imperfect, they can't really be changed all that much. People just have a certain amount of good and bad in them. Others tend to see human nature as unconstrained, that people might not be perfectible, but they're at least improvable. The amount of good and bad we see right now is something that can be altered, sometimes materially so, by kind of putting in systems in place that might enable people to get better, to improve. We find that these visions, not perfectly, mind you, nothing is perfect in this kind of messy research, but conservatives tend to hold this constrained view of human nature, whereas liberals become more likely to hold this unconstrained view. Now, this has nothing to do with politics, right? This is apolitical, but you can see just by disagreeing on what is human nature, there are policy implications, right? If you see human nature as constrained, Something like rehabilitation doesn't make sense, right? Why should we be wasting money if people can't change, right? Social reform doesn't make sense. Why would we waste money on that if people, whereas liberals are like, if people can change, then it's cruel not to invest in these things, right? But the point is that these disagreements, right, start off at this philosophical level and they kind of branch out into impacting our policies. But they start off with these kind of unspoken disagreements about like the way we see the world and the way we see people. When it comes to communicating with these groups, it's important to be aware of these disagreements, right? To understand kind of where these things are coming from, because these are the roots often of these disagreements. But importantly, we find that you can communicate differently to these groups about the same exact topic and have a lot more success. So when I talk about morality, right, let's talk about kind of doing the right thing. Conservatives tend to have what we call proscriptive morality, meaning their morality is more about refraining from doing bad things, right? Making sure that you're not killing, you're not hurting someone, you're not interfering in places you shouldn't be interfering. Liberal morality tends to be more prescriptive rather than proscriptive. It tends to focus more on kind of active intervention. It's about helping people. It's about making sure you're going and doing something to kind of prevent harm as opposed to just not causing harm, right? And so understanding just these different motivations can impact or shift how we talk to individuals, right? When you're talking about the right thing to do with someone who holds a more conservative view, you're probably better off emphasizing that the things you don't want to be doing, right, in order to be a good person. Whereas if you're talking to a liberal, you want to emphasize the things that you should be doing if you want to be a good person. And of course, we can apply this to legal settings, we can apply this to medical and healthcare settings, we can apply this to financial settings. But it all starts with understanding what actually is driving these differences and how can we communicate in ways, quote unquote, speak the language of each side.
Right. Under 30 seconds for this last one. I got a leader listening. They want to know what's something immediately, because you convinced them, you influenced them over the last hour that they want to make a change, but they don't know what to do first. What's the first thing they should immediately do if they say, I want to start improving my influence skills today?
I'm more curious. Number one thing you can do, super, super simple, right? But so much of our influence relies on us thinking that we are going to be the catalyst, right? That I'm going to take my information, I'm going to arm myself with my information, I'm going to go make someone change their mind. What we've talked about today, with a lot of things we hit on, right, points to the exact opposite of that. That if you try to force someone, if you try to kind of go at them and do battle with them, right, they're just going to push back. They're just going to get further entrenched. Curiosity is really important for two reasons. Number one, it's important because we find that it's curiosity that ends up kind of opening people up more, right? It's asking questions that get them an opportunity to reflect on their own thinking, that gives them a chance to challenge their own thinking in a way that doesn't force you to challenge their own thinking. But curiosity also adds a little bit of intellectual humility, right? A lot of times we think someone thinks this just because they're foolish or they're misinformed, and we start asking questions, we start to realize, okay, like I might not agree with this person, but I understand now where they're coming from. I understand the root of why they're doing this. It's not just that they're stupid or foolish or misinformed. There is this kind of internally coherent way that although I don't disagree with it, I understand it. And once you understand someone better, you can provide them with information that's going to be more compelling to them because you know what you're targeting.
Right, I love it. And I gotta say, this was a pretty mediocre hour. I expected a little bit more out of you, but no, this is this is really good. I got like so many questions. I just want to keep going, Joe Rogan style. But no, Jon Robert, this was phenomenal. Really, really great information. Just not just for anybody in healthcare, obviously, is like target audience, but just for society as a whole. Loved it. This was great. Really, love to have you on sometime in the future. This is phenomenal. Appreciate you being on the show, man. Especially I know you're a little bit later in the day than I am right now. So thank you so much for joining us. And guys, hope you got a huge amount of information out of it. I know I did. I'll see you guys next time.